Hey guys, and welcome back to the FFP. My name is Christian, and today we'll be going over Week 14. It's time to do some start-sit information for the first round of the fantasy playoffs. As always, guys, I want to say thank you for joining us. I appreciate the support, and good luck this week. It is go big or go home, as they say, and another phrase that I'm going to use right now to kind of as a prerequisite to some of the research that I'm going to talk about, which is really mediocrity is failure at this point. If you have just an okay week, you're probably going to lose. Typically in the regular season, sometimes you can have a bad week, but also play a team who is, 1-7 and they didn't even start a quarterback this week and you can get a win anyways. Not going to happen at this point. You're in the playoffs, you're playing good teams, they're going to put up points, so you have to put up some points. For this reason, if somebody is below average, has too much risk, just hasn't been playing well, doesn't have a high ceiling, there are going to be a lot of players that might surprise you that I'm going to say probably sit this week. I completely understand based on your position, your situation, if you have to start them, but that's what I'm going to say. I'd rather lean on the side of caution, and as always, there will be timestamps down in the description below, and always feel free to leave a comment, guys. Let's talk about what your roster looked like this week, and what moves are you interested in making as far as who to put in your lineup and who not to, but let's not waste any more time, guys. Let's get into it, because we got 16 games to go through. All right, so let's talk about it. First one, Bears versus Cowboys. Now, I'd like to talk about probably the Cowboys first and Dak Prescott. Going up against the Bears, who give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Prescott's played great lately. The last 5 games, his 1,665 yards is first in the NFL among quarterbacks, obviously, and his 11 touchdowns is third. So he's been very productive. Now, the Bears defense do give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but they just gave up 2 touchdown passes to a third-string quarterback in David Blau for the Lions. So you have to feel like a guy who's got very good weapons. He's got 3 solid wide receivers, a good running back. That offense as a whole is very good. The problem there in Dallas is not the offense. It seems to be the defense. I definitely think you should play Prescott this week. Could very well be a good matchup. Ezekiel Elliott, you got to start this guy. The last game, he had 12 carries for 71 yards. He added 7 catches for 66 yards. The one knock in his career has been that he doesn't receive that much, but last week he did it. He's done it this year. He's fine. Start him no matter what. And if there's one knock on the Bears defense, it's that they do have a worse run defense than pass defense, and they give up the 14th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. We just talked about him, but the wide receivers, let's talk about Amari Cooper. He is top 5 in yards and touchdowns. Now, last week versus the Bears, Kenny Golladay had 158 yards and a touchdown, so we very well know that number 1 wide receivers can score against the Bears. They do have the 7th fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers, but again, that number is a bit skewed, and I think they've played worse recently. Again, reference back to last week, what Kenny Golladay was able to do against them, so I would absolutely play Amari Cooper this week. The 2 guys who are a bit question marks here are Michael Gallup and Randall Cobb. Now, Randall Cobb is currently questionable. I'll update you guys in our injury update video as to what's going on there. But over the last 5 weeks, Michael Gallup is 9th amongst the wide receivers in yards, Randall Cobb is 9th amongst the wide receivers in yards, and Michael Gallup over the last 5 weeks is 11th amongst wide receivers in yards. So they've both actually been fairly productive recently. As far as their fantasy value goes, you kind of have to hope that Randall Cobb, who's currently questionable, misses this week. That will then give more value to Michael Gallup. If they both play, they come in as low-end wide receiver 3s or high-end wide receiver 4s. They're very good for a pair of number 2 and number 3 wide receivers on a team, but in your fantasy lineup, it's really hard to imagine them both having very good days. However, again, if Cobb went down, then there's definitely room for Gallup. Jason Witten, I don't love him, but he is currently 10th in fantasy scoring among tight ends, and he's got a good matchup against the Bears, giving up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so Witten certainly can and probably should for many of you be played this week. I would sit Brett Maher. He got nothing but an extra point last week. He's sort of just done a disappearing act over the last few weeks, tends to just have games where he doesn't do much. I would sit him. And as far as the Cowboys defense, they've scored just 13 fantasy points over the last 4 games. I would sit them this week. Flipping sides now, let's talk about the Bears and Mitchell Trubisky. Absolutely sit Trubisky. Now, he's had 2 good games recently, and I think that leads some people to think that maybe Trubisky is really turning a corner in his career, but I don't think that could be any more false. I think that is very incorrect. Get this. Both of his games, so he's played in the last 4 games, 2 of them have been against the Detroit Lions. And in both of those games, he's thrown 3 touchdown passes apiece. That's 6 touchdown passes in both games in the series this year. In all other games, in the 9 other games he has played, he's combined for just 7 touchdown passes. That tells you what kind of a quarterback he is. We'll talk about the Lions defense more later on, but in the end, Mitchell Trubisky's 2 good games against them is not a sign of Trubisky's success and talent. It's more of a sign of how bad the Lions defense is, at least as of right now. As far as the running backs go, Tariq Cohen, sit him, 3.2 yards per carry, no rushing touchdowns all year. Heck, even in PPR leagues, he's not even scraping by at this point. David Montgomery, he's got just 3.4 yards per carry right now. He's been a bit of a disappointment. Heading into last week, he had 3 straight weeks with just 6 fantasy points in PPR scoring. So for most of you, I definitely think you have to lean towards playing David Montgomery this week. However, he is in a matchup against the Cowboys, giving up the 16th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So they're an average defense. I think there is some room for him to succeed. That being said, in a standard league, deep league, above 12 teams, he can be played. Though many of you who are in the playoffs right now, I assume you probably got some better options. Hopefully you've got some depth, so I would probably avoid him. As far as the wide receivers go, the 2 guys to talk about, one, Allen Robinson, he's a must start. He is the heart and soul of that offense right now. The last 2 games, which by the way have been wins for the Bears, I think that's important. He had 6 catches, 131 yards, and a touchdown, and then 8 catches, 86 yards, and a touchdown. If the Bears have any chance of succeeding in any game all year long, it has been through the success of Allen Robinson. The Cowboys do give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but he should certainly still be played this week. The other guy to talk about will be Anthony Miller. The last 3 games have been very good to him. He's certainly growing his role and becoming a bigger part of that offense, and he has 0 touchdowns on the season. So he can only be played in PPR leagues. For me, he bumps down to a wide receiver 4 in standards, just misses the cut. But the last 3 games have been good. 6 catches, 54 yards, 6 catches, 77 yards, and 9 catches for 140 yards last week. The matchups have been fairly good for him: the Rams, the Giants, and the Lions. We talked about how bad the Lions are. The Giants is a good matchup. And then the Rams. The Rams are good with Jalen Ramsey, but you'll find that they're actually only good against wide receiver 1s. Against wide receiver 2 and 3, they tend to struggle a bit more. Finally, to save some time, Trey Burton, Eddie Pinheiro, and the Bears defense, I would sit all of them. You might be tempted to play the Bears defense this week. I wouldn't. The Cowboys give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing defenses, even when you include what they just did against the Bills. And the Bears are averaging just 5 fantasy points over the last 8 games. All right, Buccaneers, Colts. Let's start off with the Buccaneers. Jameis Winston. Jameis Winston can definitely be played this week. While the Colts do give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, a lot of people will be surprised to see that Winston is currently 5th in fantasy scoring among quarterbacks. Yeah, I think there are some better options, but are there better options that you can replace? Are you going to find a guy off the waiver wire? Do you happen to have a better bench quarterback? Probably not. I'm going to lean towards play him this week. Some of you may happen to have some better options, but odds are you probably don't in probably half to above half of those leagues. As far as running backs go, Ronald Jones Jr., I think he can be played. He's actually got 7 touchdowns in the last 9 games, and since week 5, he is currently 25th in standard league scoring, making him a borderline start depending on your lineup. I know not everyone's got a lot of depth at running back, and I'd still sim him in PPRs. He's just not getting anything done there. As far as the wide receivers go, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, let's save some time. They're very productive wide receivers. I love them. They're great. Start both of those guys. You would have to have absolutely phenomenal receivers to even consider benching these guys. So absolutely play them. As far as the tight ends go, Brayton Howard, I would sit them, and I would play Matt Gay in this matchup. The Colts give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing kickers. Finally, the Buccaneers. Last couple of games have been very good to them, so I think some people are very tempted to play them. They did score 16 and 23 fantasy points, but I'm going to say sit them. I know some people are tempted to start them, to play them this week because of the last 2 games, but they had touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, which touchdowns for defense is not something you can rely on. If you take that out, 2 games ago versus Atlanta, they take that out, they had just 10 fantasy points. Take that out versus Jacksonville, they had 17 fantasy points. 10 is a borderline start, 17 is a good start, but it's simply 1 game, and all the other games they've been bad. They scored 1 point versus New Orleans, 0 versus Carolina, 5 versus Tennessee, 1 versus Seattle, 6 versus Arizona, 0 versus New Orleans. So they've just been all around bad this year. It's just been 2 good games for them, a bit of a fluke. We saw this with Atlanta earlier in the year. I wouldn't quite trust it. On the other side, we've got Jacoby Brissett. The Buccaneers give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. However, in 6 of his last 7 games, Brissett has combined for just 2 touchdown passes. For me, I think you got to look towards another option. That offense is very banged up, and I don't like him this week. Again, it is a good matchup, but I don't think that's the sort of way that they're going to win this game. Even if they do win this game, I think if they do, it comes off of playing defense and forcing turnovers from that Bucs offense. And again, 2 touchdown passes in 6 of the last 7 games. Absolutely got to consider sitting him. Hopefully you've got some better options. Marlon Mack is still questioning, and he is targeting a return this week. I'll update you guys Friday. If Marlon Mack plays, he is a must start. If not, of course, the guy to look at is Jonathan Williams. The Buccaneers do give the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, but I still think you could start as a running back too if Mack is out, purely based off of volume and the fact that he's been effective. It is a tough matchup, but I wouldn't overvalue the matchup when you consider it's an offense that loves to run the ball, especially in the red zone, has been fairly effective doing it, and then again, he really is hands down the #1 guy. Nyheim Hines is a possible flex play in probably a possible low-end flex play in PPR leagues, or a high-end flex play in deep PPR leagues. Over the last 3 weeks, he has 2 touchdowns and 33 fantasy points in PPR leagues over those 3 weeks, so he's averaging just over 10 points. Quite a bit less in standard leagues, so I wouldn't play him in standard pretty much no matter what. As far as the wide receivers go, T.Y. Hilton, he's likely out this game. The fact that he recently said that he hopes to be back this season says he probably won't be back for this game. However, it's too bad because it is a great matchup against the Buccaneers, giving up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Zach Pascal, he's very risky. He's not reliable enough. Do not play him. He's had some big games this year. You look back to Houston, 106 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's great. Last game, 7 catches, 109 yards, awesome, but he has been so inconsistent that he can be, for me, he comes in as a high-end wide receiver 4 at this point. If you're desperate, he can be plugged in, but I'm not excited about it. He just 1 catch for 6 yards versus Denver, versus Houston. So many weeks ago, he had 2 touchdowns versus them, but then this last game, he had 1 target and 0 catches versus them. He had 2 catches and 17 yards versus Jacksonville. There's just no consistency from him for me to really like this guy. 2 catches for 26 yards versus Miami. He's just struggled. More often than not, he's flat and he's a bust. And in the fantasy playoffs, guys, right now, you can't really afford that. One guy who's a must start is Jack Doyle. Playing against the Bucs, they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends with Ebron out. He's got 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games. And last game without Ebron, he saw 11 targets, 6 catches, 73 yards, and a touchdown. He is a must start. He's been phenomenal. You got to sit Adam Vinatieri. And the Colts defense, they're a fair play this week against the Bucs, who give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Breaking down now the Ravens versus the Bills, Lamar Jackson, he's a must start. I don't even need to say this. The guy is first in fantasy points among quarterbacks by almost 50 points. He is so dominant. Yes, the Bills give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. That doesn't concern me. If he doesn't get it done in the air, he'll get it done with his legs. He's going to get the job done. Start Lamar. Mark Ingram is another guy to play. Buffalo, if they have a weakness, it's probably the run game. They do give the 15th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. He is 8th in fantasy points currently right now in PPR and 5th in fantasy point. In standard league, he is 8th in fantasy points. He is 5th in fantasy points per snap and 3rd in fantasy points per touch. He's been very effective. I think he's a must play in this matchup. Marquez Brown is a guy to consider playing. I don't love him, but as a wide receiver 3, mid to low end, he can be played. I tend to lean a little bit more towards him being a wide receiver 4. He's kind of on the bubble, but I think that some people are going to dislike that pick and some people are going to go against me. He is playable. He's got 4 touchdown passes in the last 6 games, but his targets and his yardage markers are so low that you are depending on him to get a touchdown, because if he doesn't score a touchdown, then you swung and you missed. So in all reality, I do put him as a wide receiver 4, though I definitely understand some people are going to want to plug him into their lineups. All of the Ravens wide receivers should be sat this week. Mark Andrews is a must start. He's got 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games. He's been absolutely phenomenal. He's got a huge role in that offense. In fact, he has a bigger role in that offense than any other wide receiver. He is the #1 receiving target in that offense. Absolutely start Mark Andrews. Justin Tucker is also a great start. He had a nice kick to win that game versus the 49ers, so good job to Justin Tucker. Play him this week as well. And finally, the Ravens defense, they are averaging 15 fantasy points a game over the last 6 games. And Over that same span, over the last 7 games, so one more game than that, they're allowing just 13.6 points per game to opposing offenses. Absolutely play the Ravens this week. Flipping sides now, we get to talk about the Bills and Josh Allen. For starters, got a bit of a man crush on him. Really like him. He's been very productive lately. In 8 straight games, he has had at least 2 touchdowns. That is combined his rushing and passing because of how effective he's been. And in those games, he's totaled 18 touchdowns in those 8 games. So he's been great. And he's averaging 21 fantasy points a game over those same 8 games. So this is a tough matchup against the Ravens. The Ravens do give the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. But I think this is going to be a week unlike any other week for the Bills where I think the unstoppable Ravens are going to put up some points. And I think that's going to force Josh Allen to throw the ball and to make some more plays and to score some more points. So despite the fact this is a tough matchup, I think he's going to be fine this week. Devin Singletary, he's played very well recently, but if you start him, for me, you have to start him in a PPR league as a low-end RB2 or flex play. The Ravens give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. Very much struggling right now, my apologies. As far as the wide receivers go, we got John Brown. He's got 3 touchdowns in the last 3 games, despite winning those games by a combined 45 points. It's funny because typically wide receivers don't do that well in games where they win by a lot, in blowout games. And the last 3 games have been some fairly easy wins for the Bills, and he still scored some touchdowns. I'd consider him a wide receiver 3 for this game. Cole Beasley is another guy that I consider a wide receiver 3. He's got 5 touchdowns in the last 7 games. 16 targets, 12 catches, 186 yards, and 2 touchdowns is what he's had over the last 2 games. Cole Beasley is going to have a role in this offense. And like I said, for me, the game script looking into this game, measuring this game as a whole, is that I think the Ravens are going to put up some points, and I think we're going to see the Bills sort of for quite a rarity, something that doesn't happen very often, throwing the ball more. And I think they're going to need to score some more points. So we're going to see a bit more of that sort of offense and maybe a bit of kind of garbage time points, so to speak. I think you got to sit tight end Dawson Knox and Steven Hauschka. Finally, I'd also sit the Bills defense. I don't think they're going to be able to do too much against that Lamar Jackson-led offense. All right, I think it's time now. We're going to talk about the Vikings versus the Lions. Unfortunate loss for the Vikings versus Seattle, but looking for a solid bounce back this week against the Lions. Here's what we know right now. Kirk Cousins, I think he's an absolute must start. This guy seems absolutely matchup proof. It's crazy the way he's been playing. Not only isn't he good, played very well recently. When we talk about like versus Seattle, just this last week, you lose your offensive tackle, Riley Reif. You don't have Adam Thielen, and you miss Dalvin Cook, who goes out with a re-aggravated injury. We'll talk about that more in a second. And he still had a fair fantasy day and threw 2 touchdown passes. He's been great. He's consistently throwing 2 or 3 or 4 touchdown passes. Heck, and even in games where, like quarterbacks, I don't care how good you are, typically a quarterback wins, and if they win a game that's a blowout, the team runs the ball a lot, he doesn't have a good day, right? Yeah, that sort of happened a few weeks ago versus Washington, but he still threw for 285 yards. He is such a crucial part of this offense. Dalvin Cook is great, but dare I go on a limb here and say that Kirk Cousins is the most valuable part of this offense. I think he's even more important than Dalvin Cook. He's been great. Speaking of Dalvin Cook, if Dalvin Cook plays, he's a must-start against the Lions, giving up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. But he does have that shoulder injury. Now, he did come out and say that he will, quote, definitely be ready to play week 14. As a Vikings fan, I'm kind of hoping they sit him or rest him for a week or at least limit his reps. What it sounds like is going back to a couple weeks ago versus the Denver Broncos. He took a hard hit to the chest and aggravated his shoulder, kind of messed that up a little bit. It's always tough for running backs. It's always one of those injuries that lingers. He had about 10 days to recover and then showed up at Wednesday practice. Seemed to be looking fine, so they played him. Just took a bit of a weird hit again and re-aggravated it on, again, another hard hit. Seems like he's going to be fine at this point. If he is limited, or if he's extremely limited or doesn't play, then Alexander Mattison is a must start. Again, the Lions do give the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs, and Mattison has been more than effective. He has 4.8 yards per carry on the season. He had 4 catches and 51 yards last game. He is a must start if Dalvin Cook is out. If Dalvin Cook plays and rests, then there's this weird kind of just uncanny valley of uncomfortable. Do you play him? Do you not? What is his role going to look like? I lean towards don't play Madison if Cook plays, but even if he doesn't play 100% for that reason. Adam Thielen, he's been out for quite a while. He is questionable with that hamstring issue. He said that he won't come back till he's 100%. That could very well be another week, but I will update you on Friday. Stephon Diggs is a must start. I don't even feel like I need to get into it. He's been phenomenal. One of the best receivers in the NFL, in fact. In 5 of his last 8 games, he's gone over 100 receiving yards. And it's a great matchup. This Lions defense is absolutely horrendous. They give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. As far as the tight ends go, Kyle Rudolph is a guy to consider. If Adam Thielen is out, you can start Rudolph. If Adam Thielen plays, I don't trust Rudolph is going to have a good day. A lot of what Rudolph has been able to do lately, which I'll talk about in a second, has been because of increased volume, because Kirk Cousins doesn't have Thielen. He needs another guy to throw to. But he's got 6 touchdowns in the last 6 games, and his role has been drastically increased because of the absence of Thielen. When Thielen comes back, that's going to massively hurt his value. Dan Bailey, I think you should play Dan Bailey this week. I think it's going to be a very good week for that Vikings offense. And the Vikings defense, I would sit them. Just 2 times in their last 11 games have they scored more than 9 fantasy points. They're a good defense, but they are not a good fantasy defense by any means at this point. On the other side of the ball, we got Matthew Stafford now. Head coach Matt Patricia, said this about Matthew Stafford, that it's week to week, and they're going to keep the door open, quote unquote, for him playing this week out of respect for his competitiveness, which is coach speak for we don't want him to play. But if Matthew Stafford chooses to play, then they're going to let him. That could very well mean he could play this week, but we'll update you on Friday. Either way, it's a difficult situation. If Stafford plays, I think you got to start him. The way that offense has been going, he's got some great receiving weapons, and if there's a weakness to the Vikings defense, it seems like that secondary can definitely have some tough weeks. We saw what Marvin Jones did, 4 touchdowns the last time they played. David Blau plays in this game. Don't start him. He's got 2 touchdown passes last week versus the Bears, but I don't trust him this week versus the Vikings, especially in the fantasy playoffs at this point. Bo Scarborough, definitely a guy to look at. He's at increased carries, 14, 18, and 21 carries. He's also got a 4.4 yards per carry. That's tough, though. The Vikings give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And heading into that week, heading into a game against Seattle where Seattle ran all over the Vikings, you take that one game out, they're actually giving up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. So I'm going to lean towards sitting Bo Scarborough this week. As far as the wide receivers go, Kenny Galladay is a must-start. His 9 touchdowns, and he's had 5 games over 100 yards on the season, and the Vikings give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Like I said earlier, that seems to be the kind of the weakness of that defense right now. Marvin Jones, in 6 of the last 7 games, he scored 10-plus fantasy points. He could very well explode in this game like he did last time. It's a bit of that Cole Beasley effect when number 2 wide receivers are able to outperform the number 1. Yeah, he's not going to have 4 touchdown passes like the last time, but he is certainly a guy who is playable as a wide receiver 3 this week, probably a high wide receiver 3 and a low wide receiver 2. I would sit tight end TJ Hawkinson and Matt Prater, and I would also sit the Lions defense this week. Now we're moving on to the Redskins versus Packers. Let's start off with the Packers. In 3 of the last 4 games, Aaron Rodgers has thrown 1 or less touchdown pass and 12 or less fantasy points. He's actually struggled recently. He's been an efficient quarterback. He's been a good quarterback, but he hasn't been a good fantasy quarterback. Plus, Rodgers is severely at risk of being in a blowout. Simply put, we've seen it many times where quarterbacks get up big early, the defense plays well, the running game plays well, and he just doesn't do enough. For that reason, I genuinely would look for another quarterback option this week. That sounds weird. I know a lot of people have a hard time sitting a big name like Aaron Rodgers. That's not me. I'm going to play the matchups, and for me, the matchup says that at best, he gets you 2 touchdown passes. Most likely, he gets you 0 or 1. It's not looking like a fantastic week for him. Again, not knocking him as a quarterback, not knocking him even as a fantasy quarterback, simply for this week. I have to imagine there are some quarterbacks with higher upside. Moving on now, we've got Aaron Jones. He's a must start. The Redskins give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. And even Jamal Williams has some value. He can be played in the right situation. He's averaging 11 carries over the last 3 games, and he has scored 25, 14, 18, 16, 6, 16, and 11 fantasy points over the last 7 games. That is in PPR leagues, so for me, he comes in as a fair PPR flex. I would sit him in standards, however. As far as the wide receivers go, really the only guy that I like at this point is Devontae Adams. In 5 of 8 games this season, he has scored 19 plus fantasy points. He just scores against anybody that he wants to at will. He's one of the best receivers in the NFL. He's right up there with Hopkins and Michael Thomas, and you guys know the drill. He's a great wideout. Absolutely play him. The only other guy to consider, I know some people are considering playing Allen Lazard this week. Don't do that. For starters, what I mentioned earlier, this could very well be a quick and early blowout where they run the ball, they even put some backups in, and they don't throw the ball a lot. But people are tempted. Last week he had 3 catches for 103 yards and a touchdown. I think some people are wondering if maybe he could do that again. I don't think he will. That was just 3 catches. For a guy to go over 100 yards, for him to do that consistently, we see stud wide receivers who can somewhat consistently go over 100 yards. They tend to do that with 6 or 7 catches a game. So, that volume of targets and catches isn't enough. But furthermore, the week before, he had just 1 catch for 7 yards. I don't trust that 1 week's performance. I would sit him this week. He is a wide receiver 4 in my book. Finally, Jimmy Graham, Mason Crosby, and I would sit both of them this week. And the Packers defense, I would start them against the Redskins. The Redskins give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Now we get to talk about the Redskins. Save some time. Dwayne Haskins, sit him. Darius Geis is a guy to take a look at. He's got 2 touchdowns and 29 fantasy points last week. He's very risky, but he's a fair running back to play. Leans more towards a standard league play, by the way. But it is a good matchup. The Packers' run defense has struggled this year, giving up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Adrian Peterson, his carries have been cut in half since Geis came back. Don't play Peterson this week. He just hasn't been productive enough. As far as the wide receivers go, the only guy to look at is Terry McLaurin, and you guys know that. Even that being said, his production has been limited. I'd consider him as a wide receiver 4 this week. He had just 2 catches for 8 yards last week. He just can't be trusted. He is a stud wide receiver. He had 5 touchdown receptions in 5 games with Case Keenum. But Dwayne Haskins is not Case Keenum. Dwayne Haskins is severely struggling this year. He's got to turn things around, that's for sure. But moving on now, the Redskins tight ends, Dustin Hopkins, the Redskins defense, I would sit all of them. There's not a whole lot of fantasy value there, so I would avoid that situation for sure. All right, now we've got the Texans versus the Broncos. Let's start off with the Texans and Deshaun Watson. Now, the Broncos do give the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I still think you should play Watson this week. He's averaged 24 fantasy points over the last 2 games, and that was versus the Patriots and the Colts. The Patriots are an elite pass defense, and the Colts are certainly above average. I think he's a very good quarterback. He's got good weapons. I play Watson. As far as the running backs go, sit both Carlos Hyde and Duke Johnson. The Broncos give up the 13th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, and neither one of those guys has had the production nor the volume to justify playing them at this point in the season. I certainly hope that you've stocked up your bench and found at least one other better option. As far as the wide receivers go, DeAndre Hopkins, he scored 15 fantasy points in 8 straight games. He's been just phenomenal. Absolutely play Hopkins. Love watching that guy. He just finds a way to get the job done, make crazy catches. He's awesome. Must play for sure. Will Fuller, he's another guy you can consider. He's played in 5 games this season. A few of them have been great. A couple other ones not so great. So against the Broncos, who give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, that does make me nervous. But when you go back to a game versus Atlanta, he had 217 yards and 3 touchdowns. 2 weeks ago versus the Colts, he had 7 catches, 140 yards. Even versus Kansas City, which was a real off game for that offense, they did win 31-24. But they didn't need to throw the ball more, so it was a bit of a change of pace for them. He still had 5 catches for 44 yards. Not a terrible day. I consider playing him as a risky wide receiver 3. If you're looking at a tough matchup against a team maybe that's seated higher than you and looks a little bit better than you, consider taking this shot and swinging for the fences, as they say, go big or go home. As far as the tight end Darren Fells goes, I'd consider him. He's got 7 touchdowns on the year. He can be played in deep leagues, but in typical leagues, I don't trust him. In small leagues, I don't trust him And I have to think you've possibly got some better choices out there, because with a guy like Darren Fells, you are absolutely 100% depending on him scoring a touchdown. And if he doesn't score a touchdown, he's probably not going to get you almost any fantasy points. I'd start kicker Kaimi Fairbairn against the Broncos, giving up the second most fantasy points to opposing kickers, and I would sit the Texans defense. On the Broncos side of the ball, I'd sit Drew Lock. Did have fun watching him play football the other day, but he doesn't have the fantasy value. As far as the running back Phillip Lindsay goes, he's got just 25 fantasy points over the last 3 weeks, and that's in PPR leagues. In standard leagues, that will be one thing, but in PPR leagues, that's just not enough, especially for a guy who does get that added boost. I don't trust this offense. It's stalled out. It's struggled. I would sit Phillip Lindsay. The one guy in this offense that I do like, I would start is Cortland Sutton. He is 19th in fantasy scoring amongst wide receivers. 19th. He is a wide receiver too. And you put him in a matchup versus the Texans, giving up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. I love this guy. He is, some players are matchup proof no matter what matchup they are in. They still play well. Cortland Sutton is what I would call quarterback proof. No matter what quarterback you give to him, he still has a good day. Finally, Noah Fant, Brandon McManus, and the Broncos defense. I would sit all of them, that whole trio there. Not a whole lot of value there. 49ers Saints. This right here is going to be a big game. Fun to watch. Probably the game of the week, personally, as far as its implications as to playoff teams and what that's going to look like. Let's start off with the Saints. Now, 3 times in the last 3 games, he has thrown 3 touchdown passes. So he's been very hot. Some of his other games haven't been so great. Last game, he didn't have a very good fantasy game, but they did win 26-18. For that reason, I think you should play Drew Brees this week as a low-end play. Don't quite have the same expectations as you would from most weeks. I don't think he's going to be a top 5 quarterback this week, but I think he'll be worth a play, especially in deep leagues. Alvin Kamara is a must-start as a high-end RB2. He just has such a huge role in that offense. If they're going to win this game, he has got to perform, and I expect that he should at least perform moderately, and he's certainly going to get the volume. That's half the battle. It is a tough matchup, however. Do note that the 49ers give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. As far as the wide receivers go, you guys know this, but there's just only one wide receiver to consider right now for the Saints. There's only one guy, and that's Michael Thomas, and Michael Thomas is more than enough. He's been phenomenal. In 5 of his last 6 games, he's gone over 100 yards. He's been great. He's like matchup proof. I don't know what it is. He's just so phenomenal. He's very efficient. He gets a lot of targets and a lot of catches. He's great. Play Michael Thomas this week. I'd also consider playing Jared Cook. While the 49ers give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, he has scored 10 plus fantasy points in his last 6 games. I think if they're going to win this game, he's also got to do something. And I think that's, a little bit obvious because this is a tough matchup against a great 49ers team. But I really like Jared Cook. I'd also start Will Lutz. He's a very good kicker, and if they score a lot of touchdowns, great. He gets a lot of extra points, awesome. Or maybe they stall out a couple of times and he gets field goals. Either way, I see this being a matchup where he probably gets a couple of field goals and extra points and has a pretty fair day. Finally, I'd sit the Saints this week. I don't think they're going to have a very good week against pretty well-disciplined 49ers offense. Speaking of the 49ers offense, Jimmy Garoppolo. Here's what we know about him. He's got 16 touchdown passes in the last 6 games. He's a fair play this week. The Saints defense isn't bad, but they do give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and he's been very productive lately, especially with the emergence of Deebo Samuel. So I would consider playing him. As far as the wide receivers go, Emmanuel Sanders, they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. He has scored just 5, is averaging just 5 fantasy points over the last 4 games. So for me, he comes in as a wide receiver 4. The guy that I do like is Deebo Samuel. I already mentioned him a little bit ago, but 4 games ago, he had 21 fantasy points, 112 yards. Then he had 134 yards, 26 fantasy points. Last week, he had 50 yards and a touchdown, 2 weeks ago. And then last week versus Baltimore, he had 41 yards and a touchdown. He has been very productive. I like Deebo Samuels a lot at this point. You should absolutely play him. George Kittle is a must play as well. Pro Football Focus ranks him as the #1 tight end in the NFL. I would sit Robbie Gould in the 49ers defense. Now, before I move on from this game, the running backs, Raheem Mostert, Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida. Guys, this is one of those situations I didn't want to talk about. It's one of those kind of awkward running back by committees you just don't want to deal with. So I'm going to put this caveat in there and say that, quite honestly, as I evaluated this, I had a theory, and my first thought was, I think that this 90% of your decision on these running backs relies purely on what you've got. I mean, do you have better running backs? Yes or no? Are you willing to take a risk? Yes or no? Do you need to take a risk? Yes or no? So I began to look in all of my 7 fantasy leagues this year and found completely different situations. People who definitely should, who definitely shouldn't. A guy who should start Tevin Coleman, a guy who should sit him. A guy who should start Raheem Mostert, a guy who should sit him. This is in Standard and PPR and Dynasty, all over the place. This was one of just absolute conundrums this week for me that was very confusing to figure out. All in all, the running back that I like most is Raheem Mostert. As I've begun to break down and look at the numbers, I feel like he's the best running back, but I don't trust him that much more. I trust him a little bit more than those other guys, but I certainly don't trust him that much. All in all, it's going to purely depend on your situation, but I like Mostert ahead of the other guys. I like Matt Bryant the least, and I probably like Tevin Coleman. They certainly do like to use him in the red zone. He's gotten a fair amount of touchdowns this season. Bengals, Browns. Let's start off with Baker Mayfield for the Browns. Now, right now, head coach Freddie Kitchens said that Baker Mayfield is struggling with that hand injury. He's currently marked as questionable. He should probably be fine for this week. I'm expecting that he's going to play. The Bengals haven't given up more than 1 touchdown pass since week 10. That was versus Lamar Jackson. In fact, in 6 of their last 8 games, they haven't given up more than 1 touchdown pass. So that defense has been played fairly well recently. But then you realize that number is completely skewed. For starters, they're not a good defense. Teams just don't need to score a lot against them. And when they do score a lot, oftentimes it's on the ground game. They give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, despite not giving up a lot of touchdowns. Well, why is that? That comes down to the fact that they've given up 4 rushing touchdowns to just quarterbacks in the last 8 weeks. So every other game, they allow a rushing touchdown. I don't think that Baker Mayfield is going to get a rushing touchdown against them. He's just not that type of quarterback. But that's the way their defense has played. All in all considered, he is a borderline play. I'd call him a quarterback 12 to 14 range. Could sneak into a starting lineup, but I don't love him this week. Again, it's the same trend that many other quarterbacks have had against the Bengals, which is they don't play bad against the Bengals. The Bengals defense is playing terrible, but they just don't need to throw a touchdown. They just don't need to do a lot. They just sit back, snap the ball, and hand it off to a running back to do most of the work all game. Speaking of the running backs who'll be doing most of the work all game, Nick Chubb, you got to start this guy. He is 5th in standard league scoring and 8th in PPR. He's a must start no matter what, especially against the Bengals, giving up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Another running back to start is Kareem Hunt. That sounds crazy, and I can't believe I'm saying it, but I would definitely consider it. Again, great matchup versus the Bengals, giving up the 5th most fantasy points, and it could very well be a blowout. If it is, that would mean a higher percentage share of carries, touches, and snaps for Hunt, as well as he has scored 14, 11, 14, and 17 fantasy points in PPR leagues. He's got back-to-back weeks with a touchdown, and his touches this season have been 13, 14, 12, and 12. That's sort of what you're getting with him at this point in the year. I would only play him in PPR leagues as a flex play or very low-end RB2, or, does help in deep leagues. You get the point. In standard leagues, I wouldn't play him. Doesn't have a whole lot of value, but in the right situation, he can be plugged in. I understand that teams make playoffs and they still have holes. In some leagues I'm in, I'm looking around like, how do you have this guy as your running back too and make the playoffs? It happens. And if you are looking for a PPR flex plug and play this week, you got Kareem Hunt, you've been considering it. Yeah, you could probably plug him in. Should be fine. As far as the wide receivers go, Odell Beckham. This year has not been great to him. He's a guy who's pretty much going to get you about 5 to 7 catches, maybe 50 to 60 yards. That's pretty much what he's done, pretty much identically straight through the last probably 5 or 6 games. The Bengals have given up 4 touchdowns to wide receivers in the last 5 games. So that helps. It is a good week for them, but I definitely lean more towards Jarvis Landry. I think Odell Beckham is a low-end wide receiver 3, whereas Jarvis Landry is a fair wide receiver 2. The way he's played recently has been great. Against the tough New England defense, he had 5 catches for 65 yards. That's amongst the best that anyone's done against the Patriots defense. Then he had 51 yards and a touchdown, 97 yards, 9 catches and a touchdown. 4 catches, 43 yards, and a touchdown. 10 catches, 148 yards, 2 touchdowns. 6 catches, 76 yards. He's been phenomenal, and the matchups have been tough. He had to play New England, tough defense, especially pass defense. Denver, tough pass defense. Buffalo, tough pass defense, and then Pittsburgh twice, who, again, very underrated defense. They've been very effective recently since they added Minkah Fitzpatrick. I would go on, and the Browns tight ends, I would sit all Browns tight ends, and Austin Seibert is a guy that you can consider playing as your kicker this week. In this game, the Bengals give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing kickers, but he doesn't get a lot of attempts, so he is somewhat limited at times. Finally, the Browns defense, they're not a great defense. I would sit them. As far as the other side of the ball, the Bengals go, Andy Dalton and Ryan Finley. I would sit either of those guys in this matchup. I don't trust them at this point. Dalton got benched, Finley got benched. It's just a whole situation. I tend to believe that Dalton will be playing this week. As far as the running backs go, Joe Mixon is a guy you got to play. He has scored 17, 19, 17, 8, and 17 fantasy points over this last 5 games. And the Browns have given up 3 touchdowns to running backs in the last 3 games. That's a touchdown per game. Doesn't sound that great, but in one of those games, they were playing the Dolphins, and the Dolphins running back position is absolutely banged up this year. They lose Kenyon Drake, and then they lose Mark Walton, and then they lose Kalen Ballage, and now they're down to this Patrick Paired guy, their 4th string running back, and nobody that most of you don't know. So of course he didn't score a touchdown in that game. That's no surprise. So in the other 2 games, they've allowed 3 touchdown passes. They're a bad run defense. Bad run defense. And Joe Mixon is probably going to have another good day against him. I like Mixon for sure as a running back too. As far as the wide receivers go, Tyler Boyd, he's got back-to-back weeks with touchdowns. He's a solid start if Andy Dalton plays. He's a low-end wide receiver 3 or a mid-wide receiver 3 if Finley plays. As far as the wide receivers go, John Ross is questionable. They did activate him from the IR as he's recovering from that clavicle injury. It's not exactly looking like he's going to be back this week, but at some point he's going to be back. And in 3 full games this season, he's got 3 touchdowns and 2 games over 100 receiving yards. So he's great. He's definitely got some value. I just don't know if it's this week. Finally, Tyler Eifert, back-to-back games with just 1 catch. I would sit him. I would sit Randy Bullock and the Bengals defense this week. All right, here we are with the Falcons versus Panthers. Matt Ryan for the Falcons. I think he's a start this week. He's got great weapons. For me, it seems pretty straightforward. Devonta Freeman, not so straightforward. I would avoid playing him if possible. Now, he is in a matchup against the Panthers, giving up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. In standard leagues, he's just not been great. He does have a little bit of that PPR boost. He is the #1 running back, but he's struggled lately. He's been pretty banged up. I'd call me a low-end RB2. Definitely a guy who can be replaced if possible, though many of you are going to have to play him this week as you may not have better options, and at least he does benefit from a good matchup. Julio Jones, now, he is certainly currently marked as questionable, and head coach Dan Quinn said that he's struggling with a shoulder injury, and he's trending upward as far as his availability for Week 14. That means he will probably play. Of course, if he does, absolutely start him. The Panthers do give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, which also bodes well for Calvin Ridley, who's had 3 good games in a row. He had 8 catches for 143 yards and a touchdown in his last game versus the Panthers. Then versus Tampa Bay, he had 6 catches for 85 yards and a touchdown. And then versus New Orleans, he had 8 catches for 91 yards. So he is on quite the streak and is certainly a must start. If Julio Jones does sit, one guy benefits from that pretty drastically, and that's Russell Gage, who then becomes a startable fantasy wide receiver replacement, coming in as a high wide receiver 3 in this matchup. The last 2 weeks have been good versus Tampa Bay, 8 catches for 76 yards, and versus New Orleans, he had 5 catches for 52 yards and a touchdown. So again, if Julio is out, Gage is a guy to possibly play. But if Julio Jones is in, it's just Ridley and Jones to play there. Austin Hooper, he is questionable. If he plays, he is a must start. However, we don't know. He did return to practice. There's still a lot up in the air at this point. He's got 4 straight games with a touchdown, though. So again, if he plays, he's a must start. Young Wei Koo, you got to play him this week. This offense has been good. The Panthers give the 8th most fantasy points to opposing kickers, and he's been a pretty good kicker so far. Falcons defense, they've scored 26 fantasy points last time they played the Panthers, and the Panthers give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. I'd play them this week. There is a lot of upside and a lot of like in this matchup against a Kyle Allen, who's not a terrible quarterback. Certainly looks like he could have quite a future in the NFL, but at this point, he is really prone towards making some of those pretty prototypical rookie mistakes. Speaking of Kyle Allen, last time versus the Falcons, he threw 0 touchdowns to 4 interceptions. Falcons do give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and he's averaging 17.2 fantasy points over the last 4 games. He did play bad last time he played against the Falcons. That was in their weird 2-game stretch where they were very effective against the Saints and the Panthers. They were a great defense, and then boom, they came back down to earth and they stopped playing so well. So I would consider playing Kyle Allen this week, especially in deep leagues. I don't love him. I don't think he's going to be a top 5, top 6 fantasy quarterback this week, but he is definitely playable and he's got a good matchup. Christian McCaffrey is a must start. I'm going to pause you right now because I'm not even going to say anything more on it. I'm not even going to dive into this. He's been insane. I love watching him. I love looking at his numbers. Every single week he's an elite running back. Guys like Dalvin Cook haven't even done that. Dalvin Cook had 1 bad week versus the Eagles where he averaged 2.5 yards per carry. I don't think there's been a single team this year to even get close to just slowing him down. Moving on now, DJ Moore. DJ Moore is a must start. Falcons give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, and he's on quite the stretch. 7 catches for 100 yards, 9 catches for 120, 8 catches for 95 yards, 6 catches for 126 yards and 2 touchdowns, and 6 catches for 75 yards and a touchdown. That has been his last 5 games. He is really, really gelling with Kyle Allen. The chemistry is there, and you got to play him. The other wide receiver to talk about is Curtis Samuel. I certainly don't like him as much. For me, he is a medium to high-end wide receiver 4. I don't love him. He can definitely be played and come in as your wide receiver 3. He does have 4 touchdown receptions in the last 7 games, but I don't love him, and I feel like you are kind of gambling on the touchdowns there. Wide receiver Greg Olsen looks like he's pretty doubtful for this week. He had a concussion week 13 against the Raiders. We don't know a whole lot about this right now, except that when he did take that hit, it looked like he was lights out, knocked out before he even hit the ground. So personally, I'm not expecting him to be playing this week, but I'll update you on Friday if that changes. Finally, I would sit the Panthers defense and kicker Joey Sly. Now we get to talk about the Jets versus the Dolphins. This will be an interesting game. And Ryan Fitzpatrick, he's got 5 touchdown passes in the last 2 games. And he threw 3 touchdown passes the last time he played the Jets, which was just a few weeks ago. This could very well be a good matchup for him. It is very risky. I wouldn't play him as a top 10 quarterback, but he does have the upside of possibly being a top 10 quarterback, so I'd play him in that 10 to 14 range is kind of where I'd put Fitzpatrick at this point. Running back Kalen Ballage was actually just placed on the IR, so he will be out, making the running back Patrick Laird or Laird, however you pronounce it, the guy this week. You got to sit him though. He did have a touchdown and an extra point last week, but he also had 10 carries for just 5 yards. That is a half a yard per carry. I'm going to say this right now. That is a half a yard per carry. That's pretty bad, so I'm going to sit him this week. The one guy I do really like is Devontae Parker. Everybody knows that. Last week was a monstrous game for him, and that is nothing new. 3 weeks ago, he had 7 catches for 135 yards. 2 weeks ago, he had 6 catches for 91 yards. And last week, 7 catches, 159 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's a must start, especially versus the Jets, who in fact give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. He is, however, the only wide receiver for the Dolphins that I would start. For their tight ends, Mike Gesicki is a guy to look at. He's got back-to-back weeks with a touchdown. He's got 8 catches in those games combined. The Jets do give the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends, but the tight end position is so thin, and if you're going to put a guy in your lineup, he's not a bad guy, especially if you're going to say, if you're in a standard league per se, and you're just looking for a touchdown, he could definitely do it for you. There is some risk involved, but with how thin the tight end position is, I know that so many people in the waiver wire aren't going to be too picky. There is one guy I like more. Jack Doyle happens to be available in my league. I put in for him. We'll see if I get him. And that's another situation where kind of thins out the tight end position if multiple teams are looking and you may not have the priority. Anyways, Jason Sanders, I would sit him, and I would sit the Dolphins defense. They have combined for 4 fantasy points over the last 3 weeks. They're averaging just over a fantasy point a week. It's awful. Absolutely sit that defense. As far as the Jets go, Sam Darnold, half of his games he has thrown 1 touchdown pass or less. The other half, they've been fairly good games, and the Dolphins do give the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. All in all, there's so much risk involved, so much underperforming and just bad games and poor play. I'd sit Sam Darnold. Le'Veon Bell, he's averaging 15 plus fantasy points over the last 5 games. He is a solid RB2 in PPR and an okay RB2 in standard leagues. The volume alone makes him a great play, and the Dolphins give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So that bodes very well for him. Jamison Crowder is probably the one guy in the passing game that I like right now. He's got 3 straight games with a touchdown, but then he moves right into a dud 2 games in a row. So there's definitely some nerves involved there. The Dolphins give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So there's definitely a lot of risk involved. He comes in to me as a mid to low end wide receiver 3. Don't love him, really don't, but he can be played. Ryan Griffin, the last 3 games, he's got 13 catches, 152 yards, and 2 touchdowns over the last 3 games. That's what he's combined for against a team giving up the 14th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Griffin should be played this week, not as a top 5 tight end. I've said that, some other positions, especially quarterback. I'm not expecting to have a monster day. I don't love him. He's no Travis Kelce, but he is certainly playable. And at the thin tight end position, don't make the mistake of looking for another guy who probably isn't out there. I would sit kicker Sam Ficken. It's just very volatile fantasy value for Sam Ficken. He's not a bad kicker, but that offense has hurt him, and the inconsistency has been very bad to him. And he just hasn't attempted enough field goals every week for me to really trust that performance. And finally, the Jets defense, I would sit them this week as well. Let's talk about Phillip Rivers versus the Jaguars this week. He's averaging just 13.6 fantasy points a game over the last 5 games. He struggled. I'm going to sit him this week, guys. Melvin Gordon, though, is a guy you shouldn't sit, with 5 touchdowns in the last 6 games. And he's actually had increasing yards per carry 6 games in a row. 6 games in a row, his yards per carry have gone nowhere but up, and now it is up to 5.0 yards per carry. He is back to the Melvin Gordon of old, and he is a certain must start this week. Austin Eckler, he could also be started under this condition that you are in a deep PPR league and you plug him into your flex. He's a guy who's been very productive. He was very effective. He was awesome. Melvin Gordon came back. He took his role back over, and that's it. He's just not getting enough volume. If he were getting 15 touches a game, yeah, that would be a different story, but he's really not, and especially when they tend to give the red zone touches to Gordon. Keenan Allen, you got to play this guy as well. He's got 22 catches in 3 games in back-to-back scoring games. That was kind of a bit of an issue for him in the past, where, especially in seasons past, where he just was playing well, but the touchdowns weren't there. That doesn't seem to be a problem as of recently. Mike Williams has seemed to catch the old Keenan Allen bug of touchdown issues. He's averaging 90 receiving yards a game over the last 4 games. But over those same games, he's averaging just 3 catches, and he hasn't scored a touchdown all season long, which I want to hear from you guys. Do you think he's going to do it? He's going to go all season long? He actually could very well be possibly like the first receiver in NFL history. I don't know if that's true, but I've never seen it happen before. He could go over 1,000 yards and not get a single touchdown. Probably won't happen, but it very well could at the same time. Hunter Henry is a must start. We all know that the tight end position is thin, and he is a great option. Michael Badgley, he's a good kicker. He shouldn't be started this week based off of the matchup and the fact that because of the way they run the ball very effectively and they're very effective in the red zone, they're not kicking a lot of field goals, and that's a problem. Finally, I would sit the Chargers defense. Flipping sides now, we got Gardner Minshew under center this week. I wouldn't play him. I wouldn't play Foles. I don't trust that anyone under center right now. That Jaguars offense makes me uncomfortable. There are a lot of things about the Jaguars offense I like. I like Fournette. I like Chark. There are some seriously good weapons there, but their quarterback play is just not trustworthy yet. Moving on, Leonard Fournette is a must start. He's got huge volume. He's going against a team giving up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. If the Jaguars are going to win this game, it is going to be on the ground game for sure. DJ Chark is another guy. He's been just phenomenal this season. Is not the best matchup. He's a tough matchup, but he is a solid wide receiver too. Despite the fact that the Chargers give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to wide receivers, he has been so great all year long that his value is hurt a little bit, but I think a lot of weeks he's a wide receiver 1, so a wide receiver 2 this week does reflect that matchup. D.D. Westbrook, he is averaging 5 catches and 60-plus yards a game in games this year where he has played in full. That's sort of what you're getting with him. For me, he is a wide receiver 4 based on matchup, but he could easily find the end zone. If you need to take a risk, you could put him in there. I just hate to put all my stock in so many of these wide receivers here. And then finally, Chris Conley. He's played pretty well recently, but in a tough matchup, buried at number 3 on the depth chart at wide receiver there. I don't think that he can be played. I would sit him. I would sit all Jaguars tight ends, and I would start Josh Lambo. He's been a very good kicker this year. Finally, the Jaguars defense, they can be started in deep leagues, as the Chargers have 9 turnovers in the last 3 games. But in a standard 12-team league, I probably lean towards looking towards another option. Hopefully another option. I think you could find some guys with some defenses, with more upside. Because for me, that's the thing with the Jaguars. I think they're a fine defense in a fair matchup, but I don't think they've got a massive upside. I don't think they've just got the ability to explode this week, and I'd like a little more upside from my defense if I'm going to be putting them in there. We got the Patriots versus the Chiefs this week. Pat Mahomes, start him. The Patriots give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but he's Pat Mahomes. He's been so effective. I think last week Deshaun Watson showed us that Patriots defense, that Patriots as a whole, they can be beat, they can be stopped, and you can move the ball against that defense. Pat Mahomes is going to be fine. Certainly have a bit lowered expectations from him in normal weeks, but play him. As far as the running backs go, McCoy, Williams, it's a bit of a mess there. The guy to like right now is Darwin Thompson. He led the Chiefs running backs last week with 11 carries. He took that for 44 yards and a touchdown. Now, the Patriots give up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, so for me, he comes in as a wide receiver 3. LaShawn McCoy's got back-to-back games with a rushing touchdown, but last game he just 5 carries for 10 yards. So for me, he comes as a low-end running back 3. And Damian Williams, he's got a very small chance to play this week. He's probably not going to play. Even if he does, he will be limited. So I would sit all of those guys this week. I don't like any of them at this point, to be honest with you. As far as the wide receivers go, Tyreek Hill is a must start. In this matchup, he's downgraded to a wide receiver 2, but still start him for sure. And Sammy Watkins, he's really disappeared lately. He hasn't scored a touchdown since week 1, and that has been a major problem for me. I would call him a low-end wide receiver 3 or a wide receiver 4. I think he's going to get a bit of that Cole Beasley effect. I think he could certainly get a boost in volume as Tyreek Hill is going to be facing Stephon Gilmore, but that's really all I like about him. He has struggled lately, but again, he's got Pat Mahomes. It's a tough situation, so I lean towards looking towards another option, but I can also understand playing him. There's just risk involved because he hasn't found the end zone in so long, and the question is, when is that going to turn around? When is that going to happen? This could very well be the week, but it could be just another week where he has 3-4 catches and 40-50 yards. And if that happens, that kind of sucks for your fantasy team, doesn't it? You got to start Travis Kelce for sure this week, and I would sit Harrison Butker and the Chiefs defense. Flipping sides now to the Patriots and Tom Brady. In 6 of the last 7 games, he has been just wildly average. He has just 8 touchdowns in those 7 games. So, in those 6 games. Last game he did have 3 touchdowns, but that was a bit of an anomaly for the Patriots, who are not used to being down by so much. So that was a bit of a flipped script. Hard to imagine that's going to happen most weeks. I would probably consider sitting Tom Brady, and if you play him as probably a range from 10 to 16 sort of quarterback this week. The one thing that benefits him is the Chiefs giving up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. As far as the running backs go, Sony Michel, he hasn't scored or topped 8 fantasy points in basically 5 games. The Chiefs do give up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, but if you're going to jump on that hype, the guy to capitalize on that has got to be James White. 14 carries for 79 yards and 8 catches for 98 yards last game. He's also got 2 touchdowns last game and 3 touchdowns in the last 4 games. He is risk-filled, but he is a solid RB2 in PPR leagues and a high-end RB3 or flex play in standard leagues. Again, a lot of his value does come from his ability to do work in the passing game. You absolutely have to start Julian Edelman this week. He's phenomenal every week. He's a PPR stud, and he is just one of the cornerstones and staples of that offense. He's going to get his touches. He's going to get his targets. In fact, the more the Patriots struggle, the more targets he gets, making him a real win-win. If the Patriots offense is high-flying, scoring lots of touchdowns, great. More touchdowns to go around. Good for Julian Edelman. It's awesome. But if they struggle, where does the ball go more? goes to Julian Edelman, so it's sort of one of those win-wins, a definite start this week. Mohamed Sanu, he's got 5 catches for 18 yards in the last 2 games. I would probably sit him either way, honestly, the way he's been playing. I don't trust him. I don't trust Philip Dorsett either. He's got 5 catches for 48 yards in the last 2 games. And the one area where the Chiefs seem to excel is that they give up the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So I would sit them. I would also sit the Patriots defense and the Patriots tight ends, as well as a mid-end start kicker, Nick Folk. All right, guys, we've got a straightforward matchup here, Titans versus Raiders. There's not too much fantasy value in this game. Quite honestly, both of these offenses have had their struggles. But let's start off with the Raiders. They've significantly struggled last game without Hunter Renfrow. That was pretty clear. Derek Carr very much struggled. He's got just 3 touchdowns in the last 5 games, so I would sit him against an above-average Titans pass defense. I'd start Josh Jacobs. In 5 of the last 8 games, he's gone over 100 rushing yards. He's one of the best running backs in the NFL. That much is very clear. And just a rookie, that's great. Plus, the Titans give up the 13th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So, much like every other game this season, the Raiders are going to run the ball with Josh Jacobs. That is their formula for success. Tyrell Williams, he's averaging under 3 catches a game over the last 6 games. He started off the season very hot with like 5 touchdowns in 5 games, but since then he has seriously slowed down. In the absence of Hunter Renfrow, though, he should get a little bit more targets, a little bit more attention from his quarterback, Derek Carr. I'd call him a high-end wide receiver 3. Hunter Renfrow is out with a fractured rib and punctured lung. Sounds like he got hit really hard, fractured his rib, and some of the bone actually punctured his lung. That sounds really painful, and it also sounds like it's fairly safe to say he will be out for at least a few more weeks. Darren Waller is a must-start. Waller is this week against the Titans, who give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. I would sit kicker Daniel Carlson and the Raiders defense. The Raiders defense has struggled, and they have not been a good defense as a whole or a good fantasy defense. And Daniel Carlson, not a bad kicker. I just don't trust this offense right now the way that Derek Carr has been playing. I don't imagine they're going to put him in enough situations to kick enough field goals or extra points, so I would sit him. On the other side of the ball, another offense not loaded with fantasy talent. The one guy I do like is Ryan Tannehill and Derrick Henry. Tannehill is averaging 23 fantasy points a game over the last 6 games. A lot of that is what he's doing on the ground, though, not so much in the passing game. And the Raiders give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing QBs. So I would play Tannehill this week. In fact, in my league, I picked him up. I plugged him in this week in my fantasy playoff matchup week 1, so we'll see how that goes. I've also got Derrick Henry. He is 3rd in fantasy scoring in PPR leagues. This is a guy who's not known for receiving the ball. He's averaging over just 1 catch a game, and he is still 3rd in PPR leagues. This guy's a truck. He's a monster. Absolutely play Derrick Henry. Love watching him play. That's a bit of old school flashback football when I watch him, but he gets the job done, so no complaints there. A.J. Brown, not great play, but the Raiders give up the 13th most fantasy points to wide receivers. Brown has been a bit volatile this year. Wide receiver, I think what we're seeing is that he needs another wideout to complement him. That would certainly give him a little bit less attention from defenses, and I think we'd see some more consistency. But he does have upside. Wide receiver 3 this week, that's what I would consider him. I would sit both Walker and Jonnu Smith this week. I don't trust either of those guys, and I would sit Ryan Suckup and the Titans defense. Now we got the Cardinals versus the Steelers, and Kyler Murray going against the Steelers, who give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. However, I'd still suggest playing Kyler Murray this week. It seems like a tough matchup, but I don't think it's quite as tough as it seems. Now, I'm not knocking the Steelers' defense. They are much improved from where they started the year, and they are much improved since they added Minkah Fitzpatrick. But after looking at it, Kyler Murray is one of the best, if not the best quarterback that they have played since week 5. So this is going to be a bit of a test for them. I think that Kyler Murray can have a good day. I'd actually play him this week. As far as the running backs go, Kenyon Drake, David Johnson, Chase Edmonds, I'm going to sit all of these guys. The Steelers give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs, and they haven't given up a rushing touchdown rushing touchdown to a running back since week 5. Guys, since week 5, it has been so many weeks since a running back has had a rushing touchdown against them. and it was Mark Ingram. It was a very hot Ravens offense. I don't trust any running backs. Kenyon Drake came on the scene. He looked great. Since then, he has stepped back a bit. David Johnson's great, but the volume's not there. Chase Edmonds come back. It's one of those situations. It's just a fantasy guy. It just gives me a headache. It's a real running back by committee. Sorry, I hate that word. It makes me uncomfortable. But as far as the wide receivers go, we got Larry Fitzgerald. Start him as a wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues. And Christian Kirk, in my book, he's a wide receiver 4. He's got massive upside, but he also tends to disappear in some games. And he's going to be lining up, getting that #1 attention most likely from the Steelers defense. So if you're looking for a gamble play at wide receiver 3, Kirk could go into your lineup. I'd call him a wideout 4 this week. I would sit the Cardinals tight ends and Zane Gonzalez as well, as Steelers do give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to opposing kickers. And I'd sit the Cardinals defense. They scored 1 point or less in 3 of their last 4 games. That defense has been absolutely awful, not only from a football perspective, but also from a fantasy perspective. As far as the Steelers go, we've got Devlin Hodges. Now, the Cardinals give up the most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, and he just threw 212 yards in a nice comeback win versus the Browns. So there's a lot to like there. However, we're going to talk about it a little bit more later on. Juju Smith-Schuster might be out. I don't have a whole lot of faith in him, but you do have to remember that Jared Goff had 3 weeks without a touchdown and then managed 34 fantasy points and 424 yards versus them. So if you're looking in deep leagues and you want to plug and play a quarterback, Devlin Hodges might be the guy to put in there. That is super risky, but it could be the home run you need. If you're looking at a situation right now, you're looking at your lineup and saying, this looks bad. I don't trust. I think I'm going to lose. This guy's got some great weapons. You might want to go ahead and do that. As far as the running backs go, James Conner. Head coach Mike Tomlin said that he's struggling with a shoulder and is questionable for week 14. He also said that Conner, he's got a better chance to practice Wednesday than Juju Smith-Schuster. Of course, he may practice. We'll see. We'll get some updates on this, and I'll talk more about it on our Friday update injury video. Benny Snell Jr., he's been a solid rookie and a running back 3 right now if James Conner sits. Otherwise, he gets bumped down to a running back 4. The reason for me right now as to why he's a running back 3, not a running back 2, is that, and this is even a fair matchup, it's just that Trey Edmonds is there, Jalen Samuels is there, James Conner might be back, Jalen Samuels is going to get his touches, his receptions. It's just like, is he going to get enough volume to trust him? For me, that makes me a bit nervous. I would tend to avoid him this week. If you do, you could play him as a low-end RB2. I consider him maybe a shade more on the running back 3 side. As far as the wide receivers go, Juju Smith-Schuster is questionable. He's struggling with that knee injury, and again, doesn't sound like he's very likely to practice on Wednesday or probably Thursday. Quite honestly, personally, I'd put him in as doubtful for this game versus the Cardinals. That's what I would start looking for other options if you were planning on playing Juju. As far as the wide receiver, James Washington seems like a must-play at this point. The last 4 or 5 games have been good to him. 4 catches for 69 yards versus the Colts, which is a good pass defense, by the way. Then he played the Rams. He had 6 catches, 90 yards, and a touchdown. 3 catches and 49 yards versus Cleveland. Then 98 yards and a touchdown versus Cincinnati. And then versus Cleveland again, he had 4 catches, 111 yards, and a touchdown. He has really turned things around. And this is a great matchup. Did you know the Cardinals give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers? I think you have to play James Washington as a high-end wide receiver 2 this week. I would sit Vance McDonald. You could start him in 16-team leagues if Juju Smith-Schuster is out. Otherwise, that's it. I wouldn't play him under any other circumstance. I'd also sit Chris Boswell. And the Steelers' defense, they have scored 10-plus fantasy points in 9 of their last 10 games. And the Cardinals give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing defenses. So I would also consider starting the Steelers this week. But to rehash this, just to clarify my misspeaking there, I would sit Chris Boswell, but start the Steelers defense. Certainly struggling here. It's getting quite late in the night, but let's continue on this video and talk about our last couple games here. We got Seahawks versus Rams. Russell Wilson start. Rashad Penny start. He's got back-to-back games with a touchdown, 129 rushing yards, 74 rushing yards. He's looked great. I'd play Penny this week. It's tough, though, because Chris Carson also had a good game. Last game, he had 21 carries for over 100 yards and a touchdown. Both of those guys can be played as low-end RB2s. It's so hard to say who I trust more at this point. I probably wouldn't even go there. However, the Rams do give the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs. As far as the wide receivers go, Tyler Lockett. Last game, he had 3 targets for 0 catches. He just got shut down by Xavier Rhodes, and this could be another tough week for him against Jalen Ramsey. For me, he is a low-end wide receiver 3, probably a mid-end wide receiver 4. Ramsey allowed just 2 touchdowns since coming to the Rams. He's given up just 2 touchdowns since playing for the Rams, and that was in a 45-point meltdown to the nearly unstoppable Baltimore Ravens. So what do you expect? That whole that whole defense got lit up by the Ravens offense. Other than that, he hasn't given up a touchdown all year to wide receivers he's faced. Josh Gordon, he's got 5 catches and 54 yards in his last 5 games. I'd sit Josh Gordon at this point. The production simply isn't there. The guy that I do like this week is DK Metcalf. The Rams have given up 3 touchdowns to wide receiver 2s in the last 3 games. So the number 2 wide receiver on the team has scored 3 times in 3 games. He's been very productive recently. 6 catches for 75 yards versus the Vikings. He had 2 catches versus Atlanta, 123 yards and a touchdown versus Tampa Bay. He had 6 catches, 70 yards versus a tough San Francisco defense. The guy I put my money on this week is DK Metcalf. Start him as a mid-wide receiver 2. As the tight end Jacob Hollister goes, I would sit him this week. I would sit Jacob Hollister. He's got a tough matchup against a defense giving up the 8th fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. I would start the Seahawks defense, and I would start kicker Jason Myers. Certainly struggling with my words here at this point. Anyways, flipping on sides now to the Rams, Jared Goff. He can be played as a quarterback 12 to 14 this week, but nothing more than that. So basically, essentially, play him in deep leagues. Todd Gurley and Cooper Kupp are both must-starts. They have been electric this year. And another guy that's pretty red hot right now is Robert Woods. I would play him. Over the last 3 games, he has been a wide receiver 2 in PPR leagues, essentially. He had 7 catches, 95 yards, then 6 catches, 97 yards, then 13 catches, 137 yards. So yeah, in PPR leagues, he's a wide receiver 2. In standard leagues, he's a wide receiver 3. Brandon Cooks should be sat. He has really been completely relegated recently to the wide receiver 3 role, and he's struggled quite a bit since returning from his injury. Tyler Higbee had 7 catches, 107 yards, and a touchdown last game. However, it was in a good matchup, and Gerald Everett is out. When Gerald Everett is in, when he is playing, Everett is the number 1 tight end in that team. So if Everett plays, I would start him this week. If he is out, I would start Higbee this week. Why would I start whichever tight end is the guy playing as the number 1 guy? Well, because in this matchup, they're playing a defense that gives up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends, so they could certainly capitalize. Finally, I would start kicker Greg Zuerlein, make Legatron. He's been great, and I would sit the Rams defense. All right, guys, we got our final game here, and it is Giants versus Eagles. Starting about Carson Wentz. Prior to last week, it had been 8 weeks since he threw more than 1 touchdown pass. That being said, I still think he isn't a horrible play this week. The Giants do give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. He really clicked well with Alshon Jeffrey last week, and that offense didn't look too bad. As far as the running backs go, Jordan Howard is questionable with that shoulder injury. I'll update you on Friday. Could be one of those aggravating. I'm expecting it to be what I'm going to call the James Conner shoulder injury at this point, where he hurts his shoulder, but he comes back, but he's not 100%, but he comes back, but he's not 100%. So he kind of plays a little bit, but he's got no fantasy value, but he re-aggravates it, so he doesn't play again. That's what I'm calling at this point. Miles Sanders, he's got 37 touches the last 2 weeks. I would start Miles Sanders if Jordan Howard is out. If Jordan Howard is out, Sanders is actually getting a fair amount of volume, and I think he could have a very good game. As far as the wide receivers go, Jeffrey's got 4 touchdowns in the last 7 games, and the Giants give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. The fact of the matter is, Alshon Jeffrey is quietly one of the best receivers in the NFL. Not elite, he's not as good as Michael Thomas, no, but top 15, I would definitely say so. He's been very effective, and again, in his last 7 games, he scored 4 touchdowns. I would play him this week. Nelson Aguilar, he's a safe bet to get you about 3 or 4 catches. He's playable, but he's not great. He is kind of a cross somewhere in this limbo in-between zone between a wide receiver 3 and a wide receiver 4. Zach Ertz is a must start. I would sit Dallas Goedert this week, though. Zach Ertz has really reprised his role as clearly considerably the #1 tight end, and that's been that way for a few weeks now. Finally, I would start Jake Elliott and the Eagles defense. They're risky. They're a bit more of a daily play, but if you want to take a gamble, you could play the Eagles defense. After all, the Giants give up the second most fantasy points to opposing defenses. Finally, let's talk about the Giants offense, which is Daniel Jones. I would start in 14 to 16 team leagues, but that is all. He's got upside, and this is a bad Eagles pass defense. Other than that, he hasn't played great, and I don't trust him a whole lot. Saquon Barkley is a guy you got to start. He's got 20-plus touches in 5 of his last 6 games, and he's Saquon Barkley. At this point, play him. Absolutely play him. Golden Tate, he's questionable, but he's likely to play as a wide receiver 3. He's got 3 touchdown receptions in the last 2 games. He's had a slight drop in production and in volume since Sterling Shepard came back, so that hurts him. Shepard has 17 touches, 77 yards, and 1 touchdown in the last 2 games, and he is a must start if Golden Tate is out, as his volume will be even higher against the Eagles, who give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Evan Ingram is questionable with that foot injury. I'll simply update you on Friday. This has been a lingering injury, and at this point, I'm an Evan Ingram owner. I'm beginning to wonder if this guy's ever going to come back. Please come back, Evan Ingram. I need you soon. It's the playoffs, and it matters. But finally, Aldrick Rosas and the Giants defense, I would sit them as well.